So I've been to a lot of alternative grading related talks. I've read a lot of blog posts. I've read books. And in my experience, there's a delicate balance to be hit. Sometimes you get deep down into the weeds of exactly how somebody did something really interesting and really useful in their own classes. How am I going to do that in my class? How am I going to apply what they thought? And sometimes it's pie in the sky, head in the clouds. It's a philosophy. You come out of hearing these people talk and you are on fire with great ideas. And at the same time, what do I do now? How do I actually use this stuff? How do I actually make a better grading or assessment philosophy turn into actually doing it practically for my students in my discipline, in my situation, in a way that works for me? So I'm trying to thread that needle today to say, how can I actionably do better grading and assessment in my own class? How can you all do that? What are actionable steps to do that without being too far in either direction? So how do you do that? Well, I'm going to try to talk through a few key things. And the first of them is a framework that's useful for anybody who wants to use better grading methods in their classes that can be applied flexibly in your own situations. The importance of finding a community to support you while you do that, and identifying the principles that cause you to want to change your grading and assessment system so that you can fall back on those when inevitably something unexpected happens. There's a few common issues that happen anytime you try to change up how you're doing things. I want to identify a few of those and finish talking about how to engage in your own feedback loop to iterate and improve as you go through this process. So with that in mind, I want to begin by telling you a little bit more about myself. So thank you for the introduction very much. So I've been using alternative grading methods as I would define them for more than 10 years at various points in the math curriculum. So I am a mathematician. I teach at a large regionally comprehensive university. This is my particular situation. And so what has worked for me is not necessarily going to work for you. And I definitely recognize that. I definitely know it. And so in the process of writing this book, that's the book, by the way, we have a cover, which is really exciting. Yes, that's a major point in the publication of a book, is having something to look at. In the process of writing this with Robert, my co-author, we realized, well, we're both mathematicians. We're both teaching at the same place. And so one of the major things that I did in the process of working on this book was to interview several dozen people across as many disciplines, as many settings, types of institutions, different positions that they were in, to try to get a sense of what is it that worked for them as they were changing up their assessment and grading methods. And so what I'm going to be talking is certainly grounded in my own experience, in what I know works, but it's also going to be heavily informed by what did these people say worked, right? Across the board, what was useful, what was practical, and what was not. And so if you want to know more about that, feel free to ask me at the end. But what you're hearing today is going to be based on that research and those interviews, which also, by the way, are the core of that book. So let's get started. First thing I want to talk about is if you want to change up your grading methods or your assessment methods, or just generally do something different in that line in your class, how do you actually know what works, right? What is practical, what is useful, and what's going to actually work for you? And so there's probably a lot of terms, and we just heard a whole bunch of them that you may have heard. For example, some of the ones up here. We have heard of a few of these. Do any of these things vaguely look familiar? Okay. Which one's the best one? Okay. Which one's the right one? Well, different things for different people. But actually, what I really want to focus on today is not any of these. I don't want to worry about the names that are attached to a bunch of different approaches to alternative grading. And the reason is I think that the name can go a little too far into putting things into a box, right? This is the way to do it. This is the approach. You must do it this way, something like that. What I want to focus on is the principles. These things have names because they're based on some particularly useful principles. And that's what I actually want to do. So if we're interested in helping improve student learning, through our assessment and grading, what are the underlying principles that matter? So I'm going to make a claim. This is hopefully not terribly controversial. Humans learn through feedback loops. So that's what it actually says up there. Okay, a feedback loop. So this is a very, very standard thing. You do something. You get feedback on it. You think about the feedback in the context of what you wanted to do. You make changes to what you were trying to do. And then this is the loop part. You do it again. You try again. You get more feedback. You see what happens. You repeat until you get into the point where you want to be. And an important thing here is the feedback part is it doesn't have to be writing on a piece of paper, right? It doesn't have to be written feedback on a paper assignment. It can be your coach next to you adjusting your form. It can be a baby trying to take its first steps and it face plants and the brain realizes what's going on. It records the feedback from everything happening in the body and that helps the baby adjust and try again. So if a human wants to learn, they're doing something involving a feedback loop. That's just automatic. Anything any of us in this room have ever learned has been involved in a feedback loop. So if we want to do something that is better in terms of grading and assessment, we got to realize that that's the key. That's what's going to be happening whether we are helping it or hindering it. And so I want my grading practices to support this sort of thing. So when I say alternative grading, what I mean is any approach to assessment and grading. You're going to notice I'm trying to separate those words, but also not be too careful about that. Any form to assessment and grading that supports learning through feedback loops, as opposed to getting in the way of it or making it harder to use a feedback loop. So if this is how humans learn, here's how we're going to actionably put that into process for grading and assessment. This is a framework, so this is something Robert and I have worked on for a few years to how do we take the ideas of learning through feedback loops and apply them in the context of grading and assessment. So the 4 pillars of alternative grading are not something that I'm trying to sell you. This is really just taking the idea of learning through feedback loops and saying, how does that look in this particular context? What are the key principles that, if you want to support learning in that way, we should do in our assessments? So 4 fairly, hopefully familiar sounding things as well. Clearly defined standards. What is it that I'm trying to do? What's my goal? What's the thing I'm trying to learn? Helpful feedback. If you want to learn through a feedback loop, there needs to be feedback. And I'm actually not going to say a lot about feedback today because that is like a whole nother talk. That is a huge topic. But I want to emphasize that it's not just feedback. It's helpful feedback. Feedback aimed at actually helping the person develop in whatever they're trying to do. If you're going to use grades at all, then I'm going to call them marks. They need to indicate progress towards the goal, towards the clearly defined standards. So numbers don't really do that very well. They don't tell you a lot. They need to actually be something explicit that says, this is the direction that you're headed. This is how you're making progress towards meeting that goal. And then finally, the thing that actually enables the feedback loop. Reassessment without penalty, meaning a chance to close the loop, to try again, and not to be punished for actually having to go through that process that humans naturally go through of trying again and trying to improve what you're doing. So these 4 pillars, by the way, this graphic is something that we put together about 2 years ago on the fly because we just needed something to look at while we were starting to write the book. And we're like, yeah, this is really awful. Let's just fix it later. You know what happens when you say that? It makes it into the book, right? So this is the picture, right? Supporting the feedback loops we trust. And that's where we're at today. But these 4 pillars are basically just an actionable way to take the idea of learning through feedback and actually put it into practice. So to make this a little more concrete, I want to tell you about a class that I've taught very recently and many times actually. And the point is not that you need to know exactly how I have assessed and graded in this class, because that's not going to be useful for anybody, right? I mean, unless you happen to be the one other of my colleagues who teaches it at the same time as me. But what I do want to do is I want to illustrate my thought process in designing a grading system for this class, so that you can sort of see how I use these pillars to think through that. And when you hit a decision point, what are some of the options available there, just to get a sense of how this can work. So the class I want to tell you about is Math 210, Communicating in Mathematics. The other reason I'm selecting this class is this can look really different than what you might expect a math class to look like. So this class is, we call it a bridge into advanced math, which means proof writing. So a proof mathematically is, in the context of this class, a written logical argument that argues that something is true. And the key there is really, it's written. So this class is called Communicating in Mathematics because we're trying to help students come from more skills-based, more what you might think of as traditional-looking math classes, algebra, calculus, trigonometry, these type things, into a more advanced mathematical setting where we're really focused on communicating why something is true and how we know it's true. And that's a big step. That's a big change. In fact, it is so much based in written communication and disciplinary communication that it satisfies our general education discipline-based writing requirement. So this is a different type of class than you might have seen in a mathematical context, but it's also a STEM class. So if you're curious, how can these types of grading approaches look in a STEM context? This is one example of it. So this is a class I teach often. It's a really fun class. I love it. And one of the reasons is I help students sort of make a big step in terms of their maturity as a learner, as people who are learning new things. So let me tell you what I think about when I'm thinking about how do I want to develop an assessment and grading approach for this class. The place I begin is I begin by thinking about that first pillar, clearly defined standards. But what I really say is, what do I care about? Right? What do I care about so much in this class that I want students to learn and that I want to see if they've learned it, right? That I want to assess it. And so there's a bunch of different answers to this because this is a class that it's cutting across a bunch of different areas. But one of them is definitely discrete skills. So this is something you might think of as sort of a traditional mathematical thing. There's specific skills I want students to learn, how to use this formula, how to understand this particular idea. And I want to see if they've got those particular skills. That's one thing I care about. But it's not the only thing, because the class is called Communicating in Mathematics. And so that communication and also synthesizing these different skills that students have and being able to write about them in a disciplinarily appropriate way and to be convincing about them. That's kind of the big picture of this whole class. So I want to assess that. And that looks really different from this. These aren't at all the same thing. And so they're a different category. I've got to think about them separately. But there also is a third thing, because I mentioned this is a place where I feel like I can really help students take a big step in terms of learning. And learning how to learn in the context of an advanced math class. This is different than students may have seen before. There's skills to be developed there as well. So these are sort of the big three broad categories of things I care about. And so I want to go through them one at a time and just describe how do I approach them differently in my assessment system. So let's start by focusing on discrete skills here. Discrete skills, right? Individual specific things a student can work on doing. And you can see some examples of these here. When I think about discrete skills, I think about what's actually usually called a standard. So a sentence describing an action that a student can take to show that they have learned something. So to provide the evidence of learning. I have some examples of them over here. You don't need to know what these mean, but the thing I want you to notice is they're fairly specific, right? Identify and create predicates and their truth sets. That's a specific kind of isolated thing. That's a skill I want my students to be able to demonstrate they've got. And so when I think about that, I've got these individual discrete skills. I think of, that's something I could do on a quiz or a test or a problem set or something, kind of a traditional assessment system. And so I'm going to write down a bunch of those standards. In this class, I have standards that are about, I think it comes out to about 16 of them total for individual skills like that. And I'm just going to assess them on weekly quizzes. So every week, this is a take-home quiz. I'm happy to talk about how the take-home part works if you want to ask me questions about that later. But it's a take-home quiz. And the key thing that makes it work for me in an alternative grading context is that I give students maybe 2 or 3 questions about each standard. And I ask them to address all of them. And then I mark students on each standard separately. So in this case, by a mark, I mean, right, how are you progressing towards showing me that you've understood that successfully? Needs revision for some sort of minor issues, or a new attempt is needed. So those are what marks look like. It's not points, it's not percentages, it's how are you progressing on making this known to me that you've understood it. And this last one, new attempt needed, it hints at how I enable the feedback loop. How do I close that loop? Through reassessments without penalty. If these are regularly scheduled weekly quizzes, then I can put together a schedule for which standards am I going to assess on each quiz. And students can know that, I can know that, and they know that in the future, they can try again. Maybe on the next quiz, maybe at some other point in the future. And their ultimate goal is to show me in this class that they can earn successful twice on each standard. And that for me is what I take as sufficient evidence to say, yeah, you've got this skill well enough that if you needed to work with it in the future, you can figure it out. So this is sort of a nice package. There's weekly quizzes, marks on each standard separately rather than an overall mark or points on each question or anything like that. And a clearly defined way to engage in that feedback loop so that the feedback and the other details matter to students. This has a name. This is called standards-based grading. It was one of the names that was on that previous slide. I don't care so much about the name, except I want you to know that it has a name and that if you are teaching a primarily skills-based class, this could be how you decide to design that whole class. Introductory STEM classes in particular are often more skills-based, and so this could be an important element of that class. For me, this is one thing. This isn't the whole point of the class, but there are skills I want to assess students on, and so this is an element of what I have. In my mind, standards-based grading in this sort of approach is an element I can bring into a class as an appropriate way to test that kind of thing. But it's not the only thing, because what I really want to see in this class, right, what I really want to know is, can students put it all together? Right? Can they take these skills? Can they take writing and communication related things we practice with in class and put it all together into a proof, a logical argument, a logical written argument? And for that, this isn't appropriate. I don't want to test students on separate skills when my question is, can you put it all together? And so in that case, there's a different element that I want to bring in. When I think about putting it all together, I think about something called specifications. So specifications aren't that different from what I just talked about, standards, except that they're a complete list of what I think a successful submission of a written proof should involve in order for it to be considered successful. And so in this class, the way that I do this is by having a proof portfolio, meaning a collection of written work that we work on throughout the semester and which is finally submitted as a whole at the end of the semester. And every time students are working on a proof in this portfolio, we're drafting it, we're engaging in a revision cycle during the semester in class and outside of class. Students and I are always using specifications like these right here as our judgment for, is this as a whole successful? Not are the individual parts of it working, or can you do this one thing or that one thing? Is the whole thing holistically a successful example of a proof? And you can see over here, some of these are really specific. State all assumptions at the beginning of the proof. Include a correctly worded theorem statement. These are individual, easy to check things. But there's also really broad general things too. Give clear, correct, and organized justification for each statement. That's a big thing. And the question is not, have students done each and every one of these separately? It's, can they do it holistically all together? So for me in this class, where we're really focusing on how writing looks in math, I'm giving lots of written and verbal feedback. We often revise these together in class, or we are writing proofs on the board. Distinguishing this from standards-based grading, I'm not judging students on individual skills. I'm saying, holistically, is this successful or not yet? And my approach to reassessments without penalty is also different, because in this case, I don't want to say, you should go and try a new one. You should try again next week in a new setting. I want to know, can they revise in light of feedback and improve their work and show improvement in that way? And so we engage in a pretty standard revision cycle, a draft, a revision, a final copy handed in at the end, and only the final copy ultimately counts as either successful or not. It's really purely formative until that point. But so this has a name. There we go, specifications grading. The name came from Linda Nilsson. She wrote a book about it. In my mind, this is, again, an element that I can bring into a class. If I have places where I want to see if students can put it all together in a written form, in a project form, in something where the point is to put the whole thing together, I could use specifications grading. So my class has different elements for different purposes. And I think that's something that has been very much missing from the discussion about alternative grading, is that different elements are relevant in different places. Your class might only need specifications grading. We've heard about some examples today where my thought was, oh, that sounds like you could use specifications for that. There are other examples where just standards would make sense. Any of these would be good. But you'll remember I actually said 3 things: discrete skills, communication and synthesis, but also I care about students learning how to learn. And so for this, there's a lot of different things we do. So for example, having daily prep assignments. This is a flipped class when I teach it. So students are engaging with some ideas before class, trying them out. I don't want to worry about them being correct or not. I just want them to have thought about it. In-class activities, practice with study skills. So explicit practice with what does it look like to study math. One of the things we do a lot of in math is we care about definitions. And so what better way to do that than to try to define what a sandwich is, okay? And then to test each other's definitions by coming up with examples and non-examples, and what in the world is a French fry, buddy? Got to look that one up every time. It's a fantastic counterexample to like everybody's ideas. And all of these things, whatever it is we're doing, I really just want to give students feedback and encourage them and help adjust things a little. I don't want to give them a grade on any of this. And so when we're focusing on learning about learning, I don't grade those things. If anything, I might record that they've completed a particular activity with maybe a minimal amount of good faith effort. But that's all I'm looking at. And you'll see that I called that ungraded there. When I say ungraded, I mean literally not graded. The word ungrading is wildly overloaded with different meanings, and I generally try not to use it. When I do use it, I really just mean I want to focus on feedback as opposed to the incentives that come from having a grade attached to something. And again, in my mind, that is an element I can bring into a class that might also have grades otherwise. So I can have an ungraded aspect of a class, depending on what I want to focus on. All right, big picture here. If you have a class and you want to design a better assessment system for it, you can think about it in the way I just described by sort of thinking about these pillars. What are the things I care about, the standards? How can I give feedback? You'll notice I've mostly skipped over that. I'd be happy to answer questions about it. What ways can I indicate to students the progress they're making rather than worrying about points or partial credit? And most important in my mind, how can I enable the feedback loop? How can I go back around the loop without penalizing students for taking part in that? And so hopefully you can see how you could use something like this to design a different assessment system or just see where things could change a little bit in a class that you're interested in. If you're interested in this particular thing, the 4 pillars in particular, that link right there is the resources for this talk. So gvsu.edu/s/2iw, it's all lowercase. There are links to blog posts, to particular details about this framework. But in general, if you're thinking about designing something, and we're going into summer right here, this is something that could help you with that. But that is not the whole story. Having a framework to organize your thinking is really helpful, but it is far from the only thing you want to do if you are thinking about dramatically changing how you assess students. And I think possibly when I was thinking about the organization here, this started out as number 1. Find a community. I just put it here because it narratively made a little more sense. So I want to tell you a little story about when I first started thinking about alternative grading. And this was back when I was just out of grad school. I was at a professional development seminar type thing for freshly minted math PhDs. And there was some sort of a panel, and I honestly don't remember what the panel was about, except that there was a guy there, his name was TJ Hitchman, who is a wonderful person, and I still talk with him a lot. And just tangentially to whatever he was saying, he mentioned that when he was in such a class, he would assess students based on separate skills and how it would indicate to students how were they working on each of those skills separately. And then students could have multiple opportunities to do that. And I recognize this now as standards-based grading. This idea caught me, I was like, oh, wow, that's what I want to take away from this. And by the way, is that not the story of faculty development and professional development? The thing you take away from it is not at all what the point of it was, right? But that's what I took away from this thing. And I think I caught TJ's ear afterwards and, talked to him for like 15 minutes or something. And then I went home. I was a postdoc at that point, and I had all these ideas running through my mind, and there was nobody around to talk with about it. There's nobody else doing anything like this. There's nothing I could turn to say, okay, what could I actually do? The institution I was at, I don't even know if it had a teaching center at that point. I wish I had had a community to support me, because the thing I designed when I was like, I'm going to use this in a class now, it was gnarly and weird and could have been done better. Let's put it that way, right? So my main piece of advice here is find a community to support you if you want to change up your grading and assessment. How specifically do you do that? Well, good news is there's a bunch of things you can specifically do here. It tends to be that, especially over the last few years, there's only been 1 or 2 people at any given place sort of interested in changing up their grading in a dramatic way. So by the way, look around here. This is fantastic, right? This is something that's caught fire over the last few years. But because this was kind of it was an out there thing, we tended to meet each other online. We would talk, across institutions, across states, across countries, through different places online and form communities online. So if you want people to talk with, there are links. You can get them in these slides. You can get them from that resources document to various online forums where there's a lot of very friendly and enthusiastic people who can help you out thinking about different ways to grade. Just one, there's an alternative grading Slack. So Slack, remember we used a ton of those during the pandemic. This is sort of an online forum. It's, in this case, one that I help run where there is a channel, so basically a different forum, for any discipline you can imagine, any different approach to alternative grading, any different learning management system. So if you want to know how to use alternative grading with Canvas, there's a channel for that. Check it out. It's a friendly place. There are other ones too. There's one specifically called the Ungrading Discord. So Discord, another particular set of things. This is a great way to find people who will support you, who will listen to your ideas, who will give you new ideas, who will tell you when you're doing something a little wacky and you might need to be checked on that. Okay. Find people to support you. Also, there's a conference you could go to. The Grading Conference, in fact, is the current name. This is something that I helped put together. The first time we held it was June 2020. And so you can imagine that we had moved it online very quickly. That wasn't the original plan. And it's turned into a fantastic online low-cost conference. It's June 9th and 10th this year. I encourage you to go to it. It's a place where you can learn a lot about different grading approaches. It has a reputation for forming useful, practical communities, especially within STEM, but across disciplines. And it's basically just a really friendly, useful conference. And did I mention low cost? Very low cost. But also, don't forget your colleagues, right? There's a bunch of people all together in the room right here and online interested in the same general things, right? You are here because you're interested in teaching and in assessment and in how these things might be better. Don't forget to talk with each other. So if you want to change up how you grade or assess a class, maybe you've got a colleague who you can convince to do that along with you. They're teaching the same class. Someone you can meet with a few times in the summer to talk and make plans with. A colleague who you can have coffee with during the semester and could just spend half an hour each week saying, what's been working? How well has it been going? Bounce ideas off them, get their feedback on what you're doing. Or just somebody who you can talk with who is a safe person to give you, yeah, that sounds great, or no, you need to work on that or something. And in particular, I think you've already heard about it today, there is a learning community here, the Unlearning Grading community. If you join that, you've got a built-in, automatic, pre-scheduled way to talk about these sorts of things with people. Whatever you do, make sure you have a community to support you so that you're not flailing around without somebody to back you up and give you ideas. All right. Got a framework to work with. You know you need to find a community. This is the time to do it. This is a good place to do that. However well-designed your class is, however many great plans you've made, the wonderful policies, the best of intentions you have, something isn't going to work the way you expected it to. You get into the semester, something's just not going to go. You discover that students need different things than you thought they did last year. You run into a situation where a student asks you something and you have to make a quick decision and you don't know quite what it is. Now is the time to write down what are the underlying principles that make you want to change up your grading or assessment system so that when you need to, you can fall back on those. You can say, okay, here's why I'm doing this. That's going to help me make a decision when I don't know what to do. So I'm going to tell you a little story about this one as well. When I was preparing for this, I was looking through old syllabi, right, seeing what I had written down in different places. And there's something that kept coming up. It was a chunk that got imported from syllabus to syllabus over the course of the years. And it was basically my late work policy. It was, okay, you want to hand something in late, here's what you do about it. And here's what I had in, I don't even know how many dozen different classes that I had taught, right? So if you want to hand in work late, you have significant extenuating circumstances, see me as soon as possible to discuss arrangements. Be prepared to provide documentation, like a doctor's note or a mugshot. Don't do that, okay? I cringed so hard in going back and looking at this. And I know I was trying to be funny. Haha, show me your mugshot. That'll be an excuse, right? Imagine that you are a student in this situation to have a mugshot to show to your professor. You've got bigger fish to fry. And are you really going to do that? And should you need to do that? And looking at this from the distance of some years, I realized, there actually is something that changed in me and my focus in my teaching. Because when I was writing this, I wanted to have a policy to be able to fall back on. This is the policy that you need to be able to follow, and I'm going to enforce it strongly. And I thought that was the most important thing to do. And I realized, actually, there is a different way that I think about this now. And what that is that if I'm faced with the need to decide between enforcing compliance with a policy or giving students a chance to show me what they've learned, I'm going to lean on the side of letting the students show me what they learned every time I possibly can. And that's not what this is, right? So I want to show you an example of how this has changed. So realizing that that's an underlying principle that I care about. It's something I really care about. This is how that has changed. And we've already heard a little bit about flexible due date policies. This is how it looks for me. And I should say, going into this, within the alternative grading community, we are all constantly stealing each other's hubcaps. Okay, this is the phrase that somehow has gotten used for this, because people come up with a great idea and go, that's fantastic. I want to use that as an element in my world. So what you see here is actually due to two people who I respect enormously, Drew Lewis and Spencer Bagley. And I'll gladly say more about the ways they've inspired me if you want to ask. But this is something that's inspired by them in terms of a due date and extension policy. So I'm just going to read the beginning of this. Here's how due dates work in the workplace. They exist, and they're important. However, there's a certain amount of flexibility. If you need a little longer on something, you ask whoever set the deadline if you can have some more time. This is usually not a big deal, but if it happens a lot, or if you miss deadlines without letting anyone know, people will start asking you if everything is okay. That is also how due dates work in this class. And then I go into the details. Essentially, I have due dates. I think that structure is important until it becomes rigidity. And the structure of having due dates helps me and students know what to do when, how to focus your attention, how to organize your life. But I don't want it to be rigid. I don't want to be enforcing the policy over caring about what students learn. And so I allow students to fill out a short form in which they can just say, I need more time on this thing, and propose a new deadline for it. And it is automatically granted. I'll only contact them if there's something I need to know or something I need to say about it. This works amazingly well in all the classes where I have used it. Students propose shorter deadline changes than I would have been willing to accept. They use it responsibly. And I do what I say here, right? If someone keeps using the form, or if they hand in something late without using the form, I ask them what's up. And sometimes that leads to a discussion about using a calendar and writing down a to-do list and that sort of stuff, right? Because that's useful. But sometimes it leads to, well, I work third shift on Thursdays. The due dates are all Thursdays. Can we just automatically make my deadlines Friday? Yeah, of course, right? I want to know what you've learned. I don't want to say, you got to turn in your stuff in the middle of working. That's not the point. So this is an example of a way where realizing that the thing I really care about is seeing what a student knows and what they've learned changed my policies, right? It led to me changing something in a pretty fundamental way when I realized that. And also it got a lot less cringe-inducing too. So this is feel good, right? This is wonderful. Hey, that's neat. I'm glad it works. This is not the only way that that particular principle has changed how I do things. So let me tell you about a completely different way where prioritizing learning takes a very different appearance. And that is when I catch students cheating. So a few years ago, I was teaching a class. It was using standards-based grading, but that doesn't really matter for this point. And I did a take-home exam. And of course, I had students write a little honor statement at the start of the exam. I've not used any other resources, talked with anybody else. And I start reading through things. And there's one particular topic on the exam where students tend to get interesting misconceptions, right? Strange and surprising misconceptions. And 3 students in a row had the same really weird misconception that I had never, ever seen on an exam before. So you know where my brain goes, right? Well, I remembered, I need to inquire into what students have actually learned. This is what I really care about, as angry as I may be. And so I called them into my office separately. I want to just talk about this thing, which, is partly because sometimes if a student has genuinely cheated on something in the sense of using resources that they don't understand to write down things they don't understand, that ends up sort of dangling them. They're out, can you tell me about this? Can you explain this particular thing? And they can't. And that helps actually to start a useful conversation sometimes. But in this case, that didn't happen. Because what I learned by talking to the students was that they had actually done something wonderful. They sat near each other in class. So they basically one day looked at each other, like, we don't understand this thing. We should get together and study it. And they made up a reference sheet for themselves. And then they did the right thing. They were allowed to use that on the final, or this exam, wasn't the final. And the problem was they had honed in on one of these weird misconceptions and they had convinced each other of it. And so that's what showed up on the exam. And so what I learned from them by actually inquiring into what they knew was that we needed a review session on this. We needed to talk about this thing. I needed them to learn it in a different way. They didn't get credit for that standard, of course, because they hadn't shown me the appropriate understanding. But also I learned that they were not cheating. They were doing something totally reasonable. And I wouldn't have known that if I had just said, no, this is obviously cheating. You're going to fail that standard, or you're going to get 0 on that particular assignment, or something like that. And so this was a very different way that prioritizing learning turned out. Also, that thing I said, failing a standard, getting a 0 on an assignment. So this is something that can happen in alternative grading as well, right? A student does something inappropriate. They have not demonstrated their learning, right? So the mark that indicates their progress towards that standard is not yet. That phrase not yet is really useful. I think that kind of encapsulates a lot of the spirit of alternative grading. But a few years ago, actually, as I was preparing to write the book that's coming out now, I read a book by Joe Feldman. It's called Grading for Equity. If you haven't read Grading for Equity, you should read Grading for Equity. It is K-12 focused, but the ideas directly apply to higher ed. And he wrote something that really caught my eye. This is what he said. Again, remember, it's a K-12 context. This is what he said about cheating. The real irony of assigning a 0 for cheating is that it lets the student off too easy. She is never held accountable for the content. Because saying you cheated, that is a 0. That's a permanent fail on this assignment. That's a fail of the class, whatever it is. It's maybe a harsh penalty, but it's also saying, you know what? You don't need to know that. You don't need to demonstrate to me that you've learned this thing. I'm giving you a pass from that because of the way that you've approached learning it. And that really made me think a lot about how I dealt with actual cases of academic dishonesty. And I do approach those differently as well now. In particular, inquiring into what students actually know. What do they know about what it is they submitted? And what can we do about that? And how can I help students understand why it was inappropriate? So it's a very different approach to things. I will let Feldman say the rest. This is a book you should get. It's worth doing. You can translate its ideas directly into K-12, or out of K-12, into higher ed. Okay. So I've been really focusing on this idea of prioritizing learning over compliance. That's definitely not the only principle you could have. It's what I know best, and so that's why I'm talking about it. I want to make sure to indicate, there's some other possibilities as well. If you haven't seen it, this is one of my favorites. Jesse Stommel, one of the biggest proponents of ungrading. Start by trusting students. I think that's a fantastic principle. And the way I read this is by saying, students are humans. Students are trying to do their best. We should approach any interaction with students with empathy as we would with any other human being. It doesn't mean trust blindly, but it means start by trusting. And I think I'll leave him there with that and just say, why is this one of those 5 things I want to make sure you hear me say today? So 1, it's important to think about what are the principles that cause you to want to use a different form of grading and assessment, or even just to teach the way you do. And actually write them down, like put it on a Post-it note somewhere you can see it, so that you know it when you're in the inevitable situation where you don't know what to do, when you got to fall back on something. Having a principle like this can help you decide what to do. Number 2, that principle can change. This is hopefully what I've demonstrated for you about how things changed for me. That is a totally possible thing. Those principles can be different, but boy, is it useful to know what your grounded principles are before you have to go figure them out. All right, so you have a framework to think about what matters. Found a community to work with and support you and to give you good feedback. You've identified your principles. There's a few things that inevitably come up when you adjust your grading and assessment practices, especially if they're in line with those 4 pillars. And I just want to make sure to mention 2 of them today. 2 really common things that happen when you change how you grade. Number 1, the reassessment avalanche. So maybe you get this idea of reassessment without penalty, and you start jumping up and down really excitedly going, this is going to be fantastic. Students can show me what they know. And then you start sliding down the slope and being buried by grading. Has anybody experienced this? Okay, it happens. It does happen. This is one of the knife's edges that alternative grading kind of balances on, is allowing students to show you what they know through reassessments without penalty and not being buried by it. And not burying students under multiple things they need to be doing as well on top of the normal work of the class. So here's an important thing. Reassessment without penalty is not the same as reassessment without limits. And so what I mean by that is we need to give students chances to show what they know and not penalize them for needing multiple opportunities, but that we can exhibit flexibility without going totally wide open. So for example, one thing you could do would be a token system. This is an idea, it came from many different people, but through Linda Nilsson in specifications grading is where I learned of it. It's the idea of having 5 imaginary tokens every student has. The number can be adjusted. And they can spend one whenever they want to do something like be allowed to reassess an assignment or extend a deadline or anything that breaks a policy in a prescribed way. The key there is it's limited. So you can't have students just going wild doing tons of reassessments all the time, but it's flexible. Students can pick when they need to, which things matter the most, which ones do they want to commit their time to. That helps keep it reasonable for you and for them. You can also just limit reassessments in time. So only 1 thing can be revised per week, only 3 between exams, something like that. Or like I described with my quizzes on a regular schedule, well, everybody knows when those are going to be happening. Any of these are ways that you can limit reassessments and avoid the avalanche. And my advice is, if you haven't done something like this before, be a little more limited than you think is right, and then be prepared to back off on that when you realize that it's okay. Don't go totally open with no structure, because as I mentioned, structure is helpful, rigidity is not. No structure is hard on you and on students and can lead to the avalanche. All right, that is one big thing to think about. The other one is going to sound really obvious when I put it this way. Oh, that word that's hiding is grade. All right, when you change how you grade, your grades are going to change. Sound reasonable? If you're in a situation where you or someone important to you, like an administrator, expects this nice, beautiful bell-shaped curve or a certain kind of class average or something. If you change how you grade, that's not going to be what it looks like anymore. One thing in particular is that a bell curve is a curve that, if this is what your final grades look like, it requires you to compare students to each other as opposed to what they've actually learned. If you have clearly defined standards and you're assessing students based on them, that doesn't happen fundamentally. This can vary a lot depending on how you approach your grading, but in my experience, the grade distribution in an alternatively graded class that sort of follows the 4 pillars often looks more like this. There's an average increase in the average grade. It tends to be bimodal with more A's and B's, but also perhaps a few more F's, D's, or even W's. And the usual explanation for this is that students earning A's and B's now, well, their grades, everyone's grades on here, is directly related to specific things and how well they have demonstrated their learning of. Students up here might have not done as well in a traditionally graded class where you do something and then it's averaged in forever, right? That's always weighing down your grade. And so reassessment without penalty is more accurately showing what students actually know. So more high grades. But at the same time, there may be some students who are used to getting by with partial credit, who have not fully embraced reassessment, or maybe there's other reasons, and their grades might lower. If you look at this and think, ooh, my chair, my dean, my colleagues are gonna not be happy with that, this is something you wanna know about now. Talk with them sooner than later. The good thing is, if you're following 4 pillars to help design what you're doing, you can directly connect a student's grade to what specific things they have achieved. What are the exact things they've done? Not through some sort of average, not through some sort of weird partial credit, but through specific link. And so that gives you a really strong way to say, this is actually more accurately representing what's going on. And you can adjust what you do based on what is appropriate, but talk to them now. Okay, there are plenty of other things that can happen if you change how you grade, but these are 2 of the important ones to think about. All right, finally, you got a framework going, you found a community to work with, you have identified your underlying principles, it's on a Post-it note on your monitor somewhere, you watched out for the avalanche and the grade changes. Don't forget to engage in the feedback loop yourself. So if you are like me, and you change up how you grade and you do things in a really careful, student-centered way that focuses on learning, 2 things are probably going to happen. The first is you think, wow, that was fantastic. Like this, I had better conversations with students. My office hours were more useful to me and students. Like I could see what they learned. This was great. I am never going back again. And I want to completely change everything I just did and make it better and different, right? That's a feedback loop. We are, as instructors, we engage in our own feedback loops. And it's the same human process. So here's something that I do. To engage in this feedback loop for my own class, well, I'm doing something, I'm teaching it, I'm getting feedback throughout the semester, I'm observing what happens, I'm taking notes, I am seeing how things work or don't work. And so I keep a class, oh, the best part's gonna be disappearing, okay. I keep a notepad called Notes for Next Time, 1 per class that I teach. This is a real one from that class I was telling you about, Math 210. And every time I think of something that I care about and want to change for next time, or that I want to make sure I don't change, I write it down in there. And this, like I said, this is real. So you can see it's across the board. Like there's some very fine-grained details. Swap these 2 standards because the order we encountered them in was funny. There's very general ones. There's a thing at the top. Letting students revise multiple times before the deadline was great, but it'd be really overwhelming with more than 8 students. I had an 8-person class this semester. Can you believe that? That never, ever happens. I thought I could get away with a little more in the way of reassessments. I kind of did. Seriously, future Dave, don't do that again, okay? And then when you go to teach the class again, read that document and believe past you, who has the big picture, who sees how the semester went, who knows if it worked well or if it just sounded like a good idea and you need to do something different. So engage in your own personal feedback loop along the way. So with all of that said, there's actually a step 0. It comes before all of this. Keep it simple. something that tends to happen once you start going down the rabbit hole of how can I design my assessments and my grading better, is you bolt on everything and the kitchen sink as well, because this is going to be a great way to see exactly this, and this is going to be a better way to do that, and I need this policy to make this happen. Keep it simple, and don't burn yourself out along the way. Keep it simple for you to make it easier to do things in a reasonable, followable way. Keep it simple for your students, because your students are going to have the rug pulled out from under them of this implicit contract of how grades work. There's points, there's partial credit, there's averages. That's all different. It's a lot easier to build trust with students if it's a simple system that you can communicate clearly and to help and let them know that you care about them, and here's how they can see it in real time in your class. And just like I said about reassessments, it's possible to put all of your time and all of your energy into completely changing and redesigning something. Don't burn yourself out along the way. Give yourself the energy for when you need it later on. All right, having said all of that, if you want to know more about this, this is the book that got mentioned at the top. We have a cover. It's available in July. You can pre-order it. And if you want to know about any of the stuff I had on here, including these slides, which have a bunch of links on them, that link will get you to a resources document with the slides, with the different things I've mentioned, with references to a bunch of interesting research as well. Thank you for having me here. I appreciate the invitation as well.